So this morning, we're going to move to Matthew chapter 6 as we're continuing with the Sermon on the Mount. And what we want to look at is, there's going to be sections here, so we'll take each one of these sections each week because they're so significant. Giving to the needy, we want to look at prayer. This comprises verses 5 through 14. Then the section on fasting. Even though it is 3 verses, we want to take an entire lesson on fasting. And I want to talk about that and have you think about it. And there'll be several questions that I want us to wrestle with as we think about the practice of fasting. In verses 19 through 24, treasures in heaven. Then as the section of Matthew closes out, there's this big section on do not worry. And it's probably one of my favorite, has been through the years in the Gospel of Matthew, because I think every one of us sitting here this morning, we have our bucket load of anxieties and worries, and it just seems like we can't ever get rid of them. We're just carrying them around with us. So we'll look at that passage because I think it's very important. Okay, turn to Matthew 6. And we have talked a little bit about, in fact, I think it was last week, we had a little section on the concept of reward in Matthew. And one of the things I'm sort of convinced of is, as I go through the Gospel of Matthew, there are some ideas and concepts that have real strong Jewish background. Because you remember, Matthew is writing to what looks like a predominantly Jewish Christian congregation. And so they come to the Christian faith with a real strong Jewish background. And it's interesting, I think, that when Jesus talks about reward in his ministry, and Matthew records all of this, the Jews had a concept, I'm convinced with all of my reading, with an idea of reward that's real similar to today's thinking. It's almost, you've heard the expression tit for tat. Reward was, I think, by the Jews conceived of, if I live a good enough life, then God will bless me. And if I live a good enough life, bad things won't happen to me. And if I live a good enough life, they had this thinking, if I do this, then this is what is owed me. If I do this, this is what is owed me. Jesus, in many different ways through the Gospel of Matthew, tries to deal with that concept because it's pretty deep in people's thinking. And it's that way today too, isn't it? I've actually had people tell me when they're going through troubles and trials and crises. In fact, I remember one person said very strongly, I read my Bible every day and I go to church. Why is God doing this to me? That's the way they approached it. And it's that deep-seated thinking, if I do this, this is what God owes me. That's my reward. If I do this, that's my reward. Well, in his ministry, Jesus will address that. And you may remember where he gives a shocking story. And even today, as we hear the story, we don't like it. It's the one where, you remember, the owner of the vineyard comes and hires people to work early in the morning. Then he comes and hires people at midday. And then when there's 1 hour left, he comes and hires someone to work. And of course, this was the practice in the ancient world. They were called day laborers. You got paid at the end of the day. And comes the end of the day, everybody gets paid the same. And everybody's going, what in the world? We worked all day in the hot sun and we slaved. And here these people came in at the tail end and they only worked an hour and they got paid the same that we did. Oh boy. I could imagine as he told the story how his audience took that illustration. It's kind of like the way we do. Well, that's not fair. Reward is about being fair. Well, I hate to tell you, but how many times have you heard the expression, life isn't fair? And think of all the times if you could get paid $1, you had to say that to your children as you're bringing them up. Now listen, life isn't fair. So Jesus, in his teaching, deals with that, with the concept of reward. And so we've, I think, laid the foundation for it. Now, what Jesus is going to do in chapter 6 is going to look at 3 religious practices and the way they're practiced that the Pharisees and some of the religious leaders would look to as proof of piety or being real religious. And Jesus wants to highlight these 3 practices and really show what's going on. If you look in Matthew 6, probably the best, yes, I tell you what, let's read verses 1 through 4, and then I'll start making some more comments. Be careful not to do your acts of righteousness before men, to be seen by them. If you do, you'll have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be honored by men. I tell you the truth, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. It's interesting that this phrase that Jesus uses, what verse is it? Verse 2, I tell you the truth, they've received their reward in full. This was a technical term used in Jesus' day for commercial transactions. And it meant something like receive a sum in full and give a receipt for that. You may have seen where if you give something to someone, you pay the last payment, they'll take a stamp right on it, paid in full. Well, what if that's the background of the meaning of that phrase? What is he actually saying? The hypocrites who seek applause for giving of alms, long prayers, and attention for fasting, that's exactly what they'll receive. But then they'll have all the reward that they'll get, and that's it. They'll get nothing further, especially divine favor and blessing from such an empty act. And one of the things, and I may have actually put it in the last slide, and if I did, I'll just read it or share it with you. But it has to do with the concept of hypocrite, because when Jesus uses, I'll come to it in a minute. When Jesus uses the word hypocrite, it's a word which comes from the theater of the ancient world, and it's a play actor. It's someone taking on a role, taking on a different identity. And there's another element to that word that is emphasized, I think, in this section of Matthew 6 that we tend not to forget about. But it is essential in understanding the word hypocrite. The definition also goes along with, you take on the role, identity, playing someone else. You're on the stage. The hypocrites, when you take on that role, it also means that you're taking on that role for the express purpose of receiving applause from others. Now think about that. And that really fits in well with this context in Matthew 6, doesn't it? Where Jesus says they're saying the kind of prayers that they are, they're giving the way that they're giving, they're fasting the way they are. What's the purpose? So they can be seen by men, get that applause and that recognition. And I think we need to think about the crucial nature of a hypocrite, because a lot of times we shorten the word, don't we? We think of it in terms of, well, they're a hypocrite, that what they say doesn't match what they do. And that's only half of the element of the hypocrite. A true hypocrite is one who is taking on a role that's not really inside of themselves. It's just not consistent there. But what they're doing is for the express purpose of drawing attention to themselves so other people will think well of them. And for the hypocrite, of course, the hypocrites on the theater and the stage, I mean, you know, their goal was to make sure that they performed well enough that people would applaud them, give them applause, and they would think, wow, job well done, so I've fulfilled the reason I'm here. But I find it fascinating that this word hypocrite has such a dimension of meaning attached to it. And Jesus just very naturally pulls that word out and said, that's you guys practicing these three religious practices. When doing the acts of mercy, it's sometimes called charity or giving of alms, and it can mean a kind deed or charitable giving. It doesn't mean just plunking money in a little basket. It can mean more than that. One writer made this comment, and it intrigued me so much that I did some digging around. So there's some neat stuff I want to share with you here in a minute. One writer said there's nothing more marked in rabbinic ethics than the stress laid upon charity in every sense of the word. I went, really, is it that important for them? So I went digging around. And one Jewish writer says, almsgiving, I want you to think about the importance of this. Almsgiving weighs as much as all the other commandments. Really? Okay. That's a pretty strong statement about giving, isn't it? And I want to look at the illustration then from the rabbis. Rabbi Levi says this. This is so funny, and I found this in a book that's called The Anthology of the Rabbis, and it pulls together a whole lot of stuff that the rabbis have written about. There are three sorts of nuts, and I mean like nuts off the tree, okay? There's the pedrek, or the soft-shelled nut, the middling, and the stony ones. The first variety can be opened of themselves. The second break if you knock them. The third are very hard to break, and if you beat them on a stone and break them, nevertheless you gain no good. So it is with Israel. There are those among them who give charity of themselves, unasked. These are like the soft-shelled nuts. There are some again who, if asked for charity, give it at once. These are like the middling nuts. Finally, there are others from whom, even if you press them a number of times, you get no good. So this is the rabbi's way of thinking about the three different types of givers. And I thought that's really cute, funny. But it gets the point across, doesn't it? It's a way to remember it. Rabbi Levi also quoted the proverb, the door which is not open to charity is open to the doctor. Which means those who do not give charity when in health, either, and this is what they believe, if you don't give when you're supposed to, you will either fall ill or you'll promise to give when you're sick. Isn't that interesting? So the whole idea of almsgiving and charity and all that was crucial in just the Jewish mindset. And that's why you see so much of it in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Rabbi Hiya says, he who turns his eyes away from almsgiving is as if he worshiped idols. Again, that's a really strong statement, isn't it? Now, when Jesus talks about the giving, when you look at chapter 6, so when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets. This may refer to the blowing of the trumpet for the public fast, and apparently there was a practice of that in Jewish practice. Or, and I found this, and I wasn't aware of this was new to me, that there's a trumpet-shaped money box, and apparently there was the recognition that when you wanted people to know that you were giving a lot, there was a way of flinging the money in the trumpet-shaped money box that would make a lot of sound. And by that act, it would draw attention to the fact that you're giving a lot. Now that's interesting too. And apparently that was, and that's a very possibility on this thing of, because it revolves around the question, do you translate the word sounding of the trumpet, or is it the idea that the trumpet is resounding? which the resounding would be the sound made when you throw the money in the trumpet-shaped box, or the sounding of the trumpet on the street corner. And actually, some writers think it probably includes both, because both of those were ways in which people tried to make sure that you know I'm giving a lot, okay? Now let's look at some New Testament passages on almsgiving. Turn to Luke 11. Luke 11:41. And this, interestingly, is in the section with the 6 woes given to the people there in Jerusalem, all because the Pharisees had their emphasis in the wrong spot. Actually, this being in verse 37. When Jesus had finished speaking, a Pharisee invited him to eat with him. So he went in and reclined at the table. I want to put a pause there and make a comment here. In the ancient world, table fellowship was really crucial. Table fellowship was really, really crucial in the way that you lived life. And that's why you will find passages where Jesus makes sure that the people that were following him would see him go and sit at the table with maybe a Pharisee or a sinner, whatever that, so that Jesus didn't restrict who he sat at the table with. And that was breaking all kinds of cultural mores and religious guidelines of his day, because you were always really careful who you sat at the table with. You wanted to be seen with the right kind of people at your table. And Jesus cut across that. He would sit at the table with anyone. And of course, that's what got him into trouble. Remember, we've talked about getting himself into trouble. Verse 40 or verse 38. But the Pharisee, noticing, this is interesting, instead of him being thankful that Jesus sat down at his table, he noticed that Jesus did not first wash before the meal, and he was surprised. Okay, so, what is this guy doing? He didn't go through the ceremonial ritual washing. Then here's what the Lord said to him. Now then, you Pharisees clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside you're full of greed and wickedness. Wow, what kind of conversation is that to start at table fellowship? You know, no gracious words toward the host here, just boom. Well, he's responding to what this guy first said or first noticed. He was like, you know, and I guess Jesus knew his thoughts. He apparently didn't say anything, but he noticed it. So Jesus responds, you foolish people, did not the one who made the outside make the inside also? But give what is inside the dish to the poor, and everything will be clean for you. And of course, Jesus then is tapping into this Jewish idea of just how significant giving is. He said giving comes from the inside. And when you give to the poor, that's what will make you clean. Because see, what he's again challenging that we've already said, and we'll notice this all through Matthew, the Jews had the idea that your relationship with God was okay if you were ritually and ceremonially clean. And Jesus goes, no, we're taking this a different direction. It's not about ceremonial and ritual cleanliness. It's about where your heart is. And if you will give to the needy, that's what comes from the inside. And he says, then everything will be clean for you. Woe to you, Pharisees, because you give God 1/10 of your mint. See, this goes back to the giving. And the rue and all of the kinds of garden herbs, but you neglect justice and the love of God. You should have practiced the latter without leaving the former undone. So Jesus is not saying, you know, you shouldn't give 1/10 of your mint and rue and all of the kind of herbs, which apparently would have been given so that the priest and all of those in some of the sacrifices could use those in the cooking and sacrifice and all that went on at the temple. So there was a use for it, but he said, you've got this thing turned around. You've got the cart before the horse. You're measuring your relationship with God by how much of these herbs you give. And Jesus goes, no, back the truck up. What you're missing and neglecting is justice and the love of God. Now, the word justice is interesting, just like the word love of God. It is an umbrella word. And Jesus assumes that they're bright enough, they're intelligent enough to take that word justice and apply it to their life and be aware of what the focus needs to be on justice, on daily living. And if you think about it from the Old Testament, it's a good background. In the Old Testament, justice meant several things. Number one, when it came to civil suits, whatever those were like, you always told the truth. You never gave in to the temptation of a bribe. So that's the foundation of justice. Truth was always established by 2 or 3 witnesses, as the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, that people, you could count on people to tell the truth. Justice. You would not take advantage of the widow, either by snatching away her property or making sure that she had no access to resources. That was justice. The orphaned was taken care of. That was a justice issue. How you treated foreigners who came into your land, that was a justice issue. In the Old Testament, there's all these things that come under the idea of justice. And I get the impression, by the way Jesus is addressing this, they had sort of gotten to where that wasn't important to them anymore. What was important was how much of the herbs they gave. That was more important. Oh boy, when we take this and apply it to today, we can see immediately how this applies, can't we? If we live our life before God and we start saying like, okay, Bible study, coming to church, and we'll have a few other external things, maybe giving money on Sunday, contribution, taking the Lord's Supper. We'll have some items that we list. If I do those, then I'm okay. And Monday through Saturday, I don't have to worry about justice issues. That's not important. What's important is getting it right on Sunday. I would not want to stand in front of Jesus and say that. No way under the sun. Now, and I can see Jesus coming back and saying, now, the former you don't leave undone. Bible reading's important. Attending the assembly with your brothers and sisters in Christ, that's important. Prayer's important. Contribution, he would say, don't leave that undone. But boy, you better highlight and make as a priority justice. Now, the love of God the same way. Boy, think of what that implies. And I'm going to say this, and it probably would be true. When he says love of God, I think he uses that as an umbrella phrase to talk about what he's identified in another place as the first and second commandment. You love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And the second commandment is like unto it, you love your neighbor as yourself. And I think when Jesus right here uses expression love of God, he's including both of those, probably what's going on. But isn't it interesting that he knows they have got it really messed up here. And so he goes for the jugular. He's not messing around. And it has to do just with this idea of giving. Look over in Luke 12, verse 33. Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will not be exhausted, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And in Matthew, it's worded a little different, but it's close to that. But notice, sell your possessions and give to the poor. Not a lot of Jews wanted to do that. It's almost like Jesus is asking the impossible. Remember the young man that came to him and said, Jesus, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And then he says to him, well, you know what the law is. What does it say? And he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and your neighbors yourself. Jesus answers, well, you've done well, you've said well, go and do it. And of course, he's not satisfied with that. Well, who's my neighbor? And then when Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan, he's actually rephrasing the question. Because when the young man says, who's my neighbor? The way Jesus tells the story, it's not who's my neighbor. Because then we would be all caught up trying to figure out, okay, who do I help and who do I not help? Who's my neighbor? Who's the one I can really respond to, another one I can just kind of push off to the side? Jesus said, no. As he tells the story, he reframes the question. It's not who's my neighbor, rather, to whom should I be a neighbor? And isn't that amazing how Jesus turns that question around, the way he tells the story? Acts 3, 1 through 10. Turn to that passage. Acts chapter 3. And of course we know this as the story of the beggar at the steps of the temple. Now for those of you, we had a few of you who came in late, and you missed what I thought was one of the most interesting aspects of the Jewish background of thinking on giving from the rabbis. They had three categories of givers that we talked about. And Rabbi Levi compares it to the three different kinds of nuts that you can get off the tree. One is the perek, the soft-shelled nut, the middling nut, and the hard nut. And he said even if you take a stone, you try to break it, you can't get much out of the nut. He says that's the way Israel is as givers. There's some people who give of their own. Nobody has to ask them. He said that's like the soft-shelled nut. Then there are others who, if you ask them, well, they respond pretty quickly, and that's like the middling nut. But he said then there are others that no matter what you say or do, they're not going to respond. And even if it's kind of like taking the stone, and when you break the nut open, there's nothing there. So you can't count on them. So I find that fascinating that in the history of Jewish thinking about giving, they probably had that oral tradition going around that. And you could see this, where that people would maybe get caught up, oh, you know, so-and-so, they're a hard nut in their giving. So-and-so's the soft shell. You know, you can see people just sort of categorizing others when they knew how much they gave or didn't give. Okay, Acts 3, this is the beggar that's healed. One day, Peter and John were going up to the temple at the time of prayer at 3 p.m. And a man crippled from birth was being carried to the temple gate called Beautiful, where he was put every day to beg from those who were going into the temple courts. That's just the way he made his living. There were probably family members, but they would take him every day, put him there at the steps, and he would beg. And when he saw Peter and John about to enter, he asked them for money. But Peter looked straight at him, and so did John. Then Peter said, "Look at us." So the man gave them his attention, expecting to get something from them. Everybody else did when they came by and stopped. Then Peter said, "Silver or gold I do not have, but what I have I give to you. In the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, walk." Wow, what a gift. He would just want silver or gold. That's what he's used to. He gets the gift of the ability to walk. He's healed. Now, there are a lot of people in looking at this episode would say that this sort of becomes a model for thinking through how do I respond to people with what they need if I don't have what they're asking for and they think they need. And that's a good question. Sometimes people may be asking strictly for money. What if I don't have it with me, or I decide there's a better way to respond to their need? And it not only is a powerful moment in the life of the early church, but it's also a powerful example for us to think through responding to the needs of others. And I think that's one of the ways that this story functions. Okay, let's go to Acts 10. We've got just a few minutes to deal with Acts 10. This is this whole section of Cornelius and his conversion, which is an amazing story. This is when Cornelius, let's see, about 3 p.m, he had a vision. He distinctly saw an angel of God who came to him and said, "Cornelius." And Cornelius stared at him in fear. "What is it, Lord?" he asked. And the angel answered, "Your prayers and alms or gifts to the poor have come up as a memorial offering before God." Now, this is we often look at, we often look at the Acts 2 experience of conversion as people who've had the kind of background in teaching and they're ready to be baptized. And a lot of that was the Hellenistic Jewish world coming to Jerusalem. They were scattered all over the Roman Empire. Here we have someone who is Gentile, and he doesn't have, from what we can tell, hardly any, if at all, of the Jewish background. And yet he knows something about prayer to God and giving to the poor. And that's all he knows, but that's what he does. And notice that as the angel is talking to him, the angel doesn't say, "Your prayers and your giving don't amount to anything because you're not a Christian. You haven't been baptized." He doesn't say that. What I'm fascinated with, and that maybe we haven't explored this enough, is that when people are trying to live before God and they don't know everything that we think we ought to know, we can rest in the assurance that God honors God seekers. And this is exactly who Cornelius is. But that's why God sends Peter, because there's more that Cornelius needs to do, but he doesn't know it. And as a result, his prayers and his giving go up before God as a memorial. And I think we do well to remember that model when we are thinking of other people who are trying to live before God, and maybe they don't know what we think we ought to know. They're not where we think they ought to be. We can't judge that. Because look at Cornelius as a good example. But he was very much involved in almsgiving as part of his religious practices. And look, I think it's verse 31. This is when Cornelius is, I think, talking with Peter. He said, 4 days ago, I was in my house praying at this hour at 3 p.m. Suddenly a man in shining clothes stood before me and said, Cornelius, and notice this even goes further, God has heard your prayers and remembered your gifts to the poor. Wow, okay. And again, this was his practice of almsgiving or giving to the poor. In Acts 24:17, there's an occasion where Paul himself is involved in charitable giving when the occasion arises for it. And then in Acts 9:36, you may remember the story of Tabitha, also known as Dorcas. She was one identified as who gave alms or gave to the poor, and that was very important in her practice. So Jesus, in chapter 6 of Matthew, he is not saying quit giving. He would never say that. That's just so much a part of one's relationship with God and care for fellow human beings. What Jesus is doing is drawing attention to the fact that the Pharisees and some of the religious leaders and maybe others too had gotten sucked into this, into the practice of making sure they knew, other people knew how much they were giving so that they could get applause and attention for it. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, and we have to discern that. Yeah. And I think this whole notion of, and see, we can ask that related to the giving. What is God's will for the one who gives? Jesus says, and notice this, we may have to pick up on this next Sunday. When you give, don't let your right hand know what your left hand's doing. Which is, I think it's a good Old Testament Jewish expression. It has to do with you give, but Mm-hmm. That's right. Exactly. That's true. Okay, so the giving. Don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing. Don't keep track of it so that you can congratulate yourself and sort of let other people know what you're doing. Because Jesus says when you give in the right way, it comes from the heart. That kind of giving that comes from the heart, that's how you are clean. So let's pick up there next week. Thank you for being here this morning.